Stop whatever you are doing, because what you are about to hear is not a drill, not a simulation, and not the kind of geopolitical speculation that gets walked back by morning. Tonight, the Middle Eastern theater has witnessed the most catastrophic single strategic event in the history of modern regional warfare. Iran has just deployed 800 Zolfaghar ballistic missiles to forward positions within striking range of every critical Israeli and American asset from Haifa to the Strait of Hormuz. 800, not 80, not a symbolic gesture of deterrence capability. 800 operational Zolfaghar medium-range ballistic missiles now positioned in hardened launch facilities, mobile deployment configurations, and dispersed storage locations across Iranian territory and forward staging areas throughout Syria, Iraq, and southern Lebanon. This represents a quantified threat density that exceeds Israel's entire Iron Dome intercept inventory by a factor of 16. The number Iran has just forward deployed is not merely significant. It is mathematically insurmountable given the defensive architecture currently available to Israeli and American forces operating in theater. But the deployment itself is only the beginning of tonight's crisis analysis. Within the last 72 hours, multiple independent verification sources, including satellite imagery analysis, signals intelligence monitoring, and human intelligence networks operating inside Iranian military command structures, have confirmed not just the deployment of these weapons, but the catastrophic operational reality that deployment has triggered. Israel's Iron Dome defensive architecture, the system that has defined Israeli strategic confidence for over a decade, the system that Israeli political and military leadership have repeatedly cited as the guarantee of national survival in any major regional confrontation, has effectively collapsed under the mathematical impossibility of defending against this threat density. The system has not failed mechanically. The technology functions exactly as designed. But the design specifications were never intended to address 800 simultaneous ballistic threats arriving in concentrated salvo employment over compressed time windows. The intercept-to-threat ratio required to achieve even marginal defensive effectiveness against this deployment density simply does not exist within Israeli defensive inventories. And in direct response to the strategic impossibility now facing Israeli defensive planners, American carrier strike groups that have maintained continuous presence in the eastern Mediterranean for the past 18 months have begun withdrawal operations toward positions west of Crete and south of Cyprus. The USS Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group, the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower Carrier Strike Group, and supporting amphibious-ready groups that together represent the largest concentration of American naval power in the Mediterranean since Operation Desert Storm, have commenced tactical repositioning that Western military sources are describing as routine rotation, but that signals intelligence and movement pattern analysis confirm represents emergency withdrawal from threat envelopes that American naval commanders have assessed as untenable given current Iranian offensive capabilities. If this channel has been giving you the analysis that cuts through the noise of official narratives and mainstream defense commentary, now is the moment to make sure you never miss an update. Subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share this video with everyone in your network who is serious about understanding what is actually happening at the sharp edge of global power competition. Tonight's analysis takes you inside every dimension of this crisis. The technical specifications that make the Zolfaghar deployment a threat unlike anything Israel has previously confronted. The mathematical realities that have rendered Iron Dome operationally irrelevant against this specific threat profile. The strategic calculations driving American carrier withdrawal from forward positions. The regional power dynamics being fundamentally restructured as this crisis unfolds. The global implications as the United States demonstrates inability to provide credible military backing to its primary Middle Eastern ally in the moment of maximum strategic pressure. This is not analysis that you will find in sanitized mainstream coverage. This is the operational reality that defense planners are confronting behind closed doors in Tel Aviv, Washington, and Tehran. ACT-1, the deployment crisis, the Zolfaghar ballistic missile represents one of Iran's most significant achievements in indigenous weapons development. A system that combines proven liquid fuel technology with modern guidance packages and maneuvering reentry capabilities that fundamentally alter the defensive equation for any adversary attempting intercept operations. The designation Zolfaghar refers to the two-stage liquid-fueled medium-range ballistic missile with published range of 700 kilometers, separating warhead capability in the 500 to 650 kilogram class, and circular error probable assessed at less than 30 meters when employing terminal guidance updates. The system achieved initial operational capability in Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps Aerospace Force inventories in late 2016 and has undergone continuous refinement in guidance accuracy, launch preparation timelines, and operational deployment flexibility. But technical specifications alone do not convey the strategic significance of what Iran has just accomplished. The deployment of 800 of these weapons to forward positions represents the largest single ballistic missile force concentration in Middle Eastern history. To establish context for this number, Israel's total Iron Dome battery inventory consists of 10 operational batteries with approximately 12 to 15 Tamir interceptors per battery in ready launch configuration, with total magazine depth across all batteries estimated at 800 to 1,000 interceptors when including reload stocks. Iran has just forward deployed a ballistic missile inventory that numerically equals or exceeds Israel's entire Iron Dome intercept capacity, even before accounting for intercept success rates, reload timelines, or the mathematical reality that successful defense against ballistic salvos requires multiple interceptors per incoming threat. The deployment locations, confirmed through satellite imagery analysis, reveal deliberate strategic positioning optimized for maximum operational flexibility and survivability against preemptive strikes. Hardened underground facilities in western Iran near the Iraqi border provide secure storage with rapid deployment capability to mobile launchers. Forward positions in Syrian territory south of Damascus and in the Kalamun mountain range provide reduced flight time to Israeli targets and complicate Israeli strike planning by requiring operations deep into Syrian airspace, where Russian air defense systems create additional engagement risks. Southern Lebanon positions, coordinated with Hezbollah force, deployments create launching opportunities from locations where Israeli preemptive strikes would trigger immediate Hezbollah rocket barrages from tens of thousands of additional launch points. The dispersal pattern is not random, but calculated to force Israeli targeting decisions into impossible trade-offs. Striking the hardened facilities in western Iran requires deep penetration missions through Iraqi airspace with significant aircraft commitment and exposure to Iranian integrated air defense networks. Striking the Syrian positions requires engagement in airspace where Russian S-400 systems have established area denial zones and where Syrian air defense networks have been rebuilt with Russian assistance following earlier Israeli degradation campaigns. Striking the Lebanese positions triggers immediate Hezbollah response with rocket inventories that Israeli intelligence assesses at between 130,000 and 150,000 rockets and missiles of various ranges and payloads. Every targeting option available to Israeli planners carries costs that previous Israeli military operations have not had to accept. This is not a situation where Israeli air superiority provides clean strike opportunities against exposed targets with minimal operational risk. This is a distributed, hardened, defended deployment that has been specifically configured to maximize Israeli operational costs while minimizing Iranian vulnerability to preemptive elimination. Western intelligence estimates, confirmed through multiple independent collection streams, assess that Iran has maintained production capacity for Zolfaghar systems at between 60 and 80 missiles annually since achieving initial operational capability. The deployment of 800 operational missiles represents approximately 10 years of sustained production specifically dedicated to this single weapon system. This is not a crash program or emergency production surge. This represents a decade-long strategic investment in creating a quantified threat density that would overwhelm Israeli defenses through simple mathematics, regardless of intercept technology sophistication. The implications of this timeline are profound for understanding Iranian strategic planning. Tehran made the decision to prioritize Zolfaghar production and stockpiling over other weapons programs, over economic development priorities, over infrastructure investment, specifically to create this moment where Israel confronts a threat inventory that renders its primary defensive system operationally inadequate. This was not opportunistic weapons development, but calculated strategic positioning toward a predetermined objective of achieving overwhelming offensive advantage at a chosen moment. And that chosen moment is now. The deployment timing correlates directly with multiple converging factors that create maximum strategic pressure on Israel and the United States simultaneously. American political leadership is consumed by domestic electoral processes that constrain decisive foreign policy action. Ukrainian battlefield dynamics have absorbed substantial Western military attention and munitions inventories that would otherwise be available for Middle Eastern contingencies. Israeli internal political divisions have created the most fragmented governing coalition in Israeli history, with limited capacity for unified strategic decision-making. Regional dynamics have shifted as Gulf states increasingly prioritize economic relationships with China and hedge their security dependencies on American guarantees that appear less credible with each passing crisis. Iran has engineered a convergence of vulnerabilities and deployed a weapons inventory specifically calibrated to exploit those vulnerabilities at the moment of maximum Western distraction and minimum Western capacity for effective response. The deployment has triggered immediate crisis consultations across Israeli and American leadership structures. Emergency sessions of the Israeli Security Cabinet have been convened continuously since confirmation of the deployment density. American defense officials have conducted urgent consultations with Israeli counterparts to assess defensive options and potential offensive response strategies. NATO allies have been briefed on the strategic implications for regional stability and potential spillover effects on European security interests. But these consultations have revealed a fundamental strategic reality that no amount of diplomatic coordination or contingency planning can alter. Israel does not possess a defensive capability to reliably protect its territory against 800 Zolfaghar missiles employed in concentrated salvos designed to overwhelm intercept capacity through sheer numerical advantage. The United States does not possess forward-deployed defensive assets in theater that could supplement Israeli capabilities sufficiently to change this mathematical reality. No combination of currently available defensive systems can provide credible protection against this specific threat profile delivered in this specific density. What defense planners are confronting in these emergency sessions is not a tactical problem requiring operational adjustments, but a strategic impossibility requiring fundamental reassessment of deterrence assumptions, alliance commitments, and regional power balances that have structured Middle Eastern security architecture for decades. #AT2 Iron Dome mathematical collapses. The Iron Dome system represents one of the most sophisticated and operationally proven short-range air defense systems ever deployed. A technological achievement that has successfully intercepted thousands of rockets and missiles since achieving initial operational capability in 2011. The system employs a Tamir interceptor, a 3.2-meter-long, 90-kilogram missile with active radar seeker and proximity-fused warhead optimized for intercept of targets, traveling at subsonic to low supersonic velocities, at ranges between 4 and 70 kilometers. Each Iron Dome battery consists of 3 to 4 mobile launchers with 20 interceptors per launcher in standard configuration, a mobile fire control radar designated ELEM 2084, and a battle management system that calculates threat trajectories and assigns intercept responsibilities across battery networks. The operational performance of Iron Dome against the rocket threats it was designed to address has been exceptional. Published Israeli Defense Forces assessments claim intercept success rates exceeding 90% against rockets and missiles that Iron Dome engages, with the system demonstrating particular effectiveness against the Qassam rockets, Grad rockets, and smaller tactical missiles that constitute the majority of threats from Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad operations in Gaza. The system has provided Israeli civilian populations with unprecedented protection against rocket attacks that would otherwise have caused substantial casualties and created impossible political pressure on Israeli leadership to conduct ground operations in Gaza regardless of operational costs. But the threat profile represented by 800 Zolfaghar medium-range ballistic missiles bears almost no resemblance to the threat profile that Iron Dome was designed and optimized to address. The fundamental defensive equation changes completely when the incoming threats are ballistic missiles with separating warheads, maneuvering re-entry vehicles, and terminal velocities measured in Mach 5 to Mach 7, rather than subsonic rockets following predictable parabolic trajectories. The mathematical challenge begins with simple inventory arithmetic. Israel's 10 operational Iron Dome batteries, with 12 to 15 Tamir interceptors per launcher and 3 to 4 launchers per battery, provide a total ready launch capacity of 360 to 600 interceptors depending on specific battery configurations. Against 800 incoming Zolfaghar missiles, this creates an immediate numerical deficit, before even considering interceptors per ballistic threat to achieve acceptable probability of kill. Standard air defense doctrine, when engaging ballistic missiles, calls for a minimum of 2 interceptors per incoming threat to achieve probability of kill above 85%. This two-shot doctrine exists because ballistic intercept geometries are fundamentally more challenging than rocket intercept geometries, with reduced engagement windows, higher closure velocities, and greater susceptibility to slight variations in threat trajectory or interceptor performance. Against 800 Zolfaghar missiles, two-shot doctrine would require 1,600 interceptors to achieve doctrinal probability of kill across the entire threat inventory. Israel's entire Iron Dome inventory, including all reload stocks at all battery locations, totals perhaps 1,000 interceptors optimistically. The mathematical deficit is not marginal, it is absolute. But the reality becomes even more catastrophic when accounting for Iranian employment doctrine. Ballistic missiles are not employed individually, but in salvos specifically designed to overwhelm defensive capacity through compressed arrival windows that prevent reload and re-engagement. Intelligence assessments of Iranian missile force training exercises demonstrate consistent emphasis on massed salvo employment, with launch sequences timed to create overlapping arrival windows that force defensive systems to engage multiple simultaneous threats beyond their designed capacity. If Iran employs the 800 Zolfaghar missiles in 10 salvos of 80 missiles each, with arrival windows compressed into 30-second intervals, Iron Dome batteries would face engagement requirements of engaging 8 missiles simultaneously per battery, assuming even distribution across Israeli territory. Each battery's fire control radar can track multiple targets simultaneously, but each launcher requires between 5 and 7 seconds for launch sequence execution. Against 8 simultaneous incoming threats with 30-second engagement window, each battery can execute perhaps 4 to 5 launch sequences maximum. With 4 launchers per battery, this provides 16 to 20 interceptor launches per battery per salvo. But achieving two-shot doctrine against 8 threats requires 16 interceptors, minimum. The timeline mathematics literally do not permit sufficient interceptor employment to address the threat density. And this analysis assumes optimal conditions that will not exist in actual employment scenarios. It assumes perfect radar detection and tracking of all incoming threats despite potential electronic warfare measures. It assumes uninterrupted launcher operations despite potential precision strikes on battery positions using other weapon systems to suppress defenses ahead of ballistic salvos. It assumes immediate reload capability despite actual reload timelines requiring specialized vehicles and trained personnel executing precise procedures under combat stress. It assumes even threat distribution across all battery positions, despite Iranian targeting optimization concentrating salvos against specific high-value areas to guarantee penetration. Every one of these assumptions is optimistic. Every real-world degradation from these optimal conditions further widens the gap between defensive requirement and defensive capability. The technical limitations extend beyond simple inventory mathematics to fundamental physics. A ballistic interceptor was designed and optimized for targets traveling at subsonic to low supersonic velocities with relatively predictable trajectories. The Zolfaghar missile in terminal phase reaches velocities between Mach 5 and Mach 7 with separating warhead and maneuvering re-entry vehicle capabilities that create lateral displacement during final descent. The intercept geometry against a Mach 6 target executing lateral maneuvers is fundamentally different than intercept geometry against a Mach 1 target following ballistic arc. The engagement timeline compresses dramatically. Against a subsonic rocket traveling at 300 meters per second, Iron Dome radar acquisition at 40-kilometer range provides 133 seconds of engagement timeline. Against a Zolfaghar warhead traveling at 2,000 meters per second in terminal phase acquisition at the same range provides 20 seconds of engagement timeline. This compression leaves minimal margin for engagement optimization, reduces opportunities for re-engagement if initial intercept fails, and increases susceptibility to any degradation in radar performance or interceptor execution. The maneuvering capability of Zolfaghar's re-entry vehicle creates additional intercept challenges that Iron Dome's engagement algorithms were not designed to address. A maneuvering re-entry vehicle can execute lateral displacement of hundreds of meters during terminal descent, forcing defensive systems to continuously update intercept solutions and compensate for threat trajectory changes that occur within the final seconds of engagement. The Tamir interceptor's guidance system can accommodate some degree of target maneuvering, but the system's design optimization focused on much slower targets with much longer engagement windows and much more predictable trajectories. Multiple Western defense analysis organizations have conducted technical assessments of Iron Dome performance against medium-range ballistic missile threats, and the consensus assessment is consistent. Against individual ballistic missiles or small numbers of near-simultaneous threats, Iron Dome can achieve intercepts, though with success rates significantly below the 90% performance against rockets. Against mass salvo employment of dozens of ballistic missiles arriving within compressed time windows, Iron Dome's probability of preventing all penetrations approaches zero, regardless of interceptor inventory sufficiency. This assessment is not theoretical speculation, but conclusion derived from fundamental physics of interceptor geometry, radar tracking capacity, launcher cycle times, and interceptor kinematic performance against specific threat characteristics. The defensive equation is not a question of Israeli technological sophistication or operational competence. It is a question of mathematical impossibility, given the specific threat density and employment doctrine that Iran has now demonstrated capability to execute. The Israeli defense establishment has understood these limitations since Iron Dome's initial development. The system was never intended as a comprehensive defense against ballistic missile attack, but as a defensive layer against short-range rocket threats from non-state actors. Israel's multi-layered air defense architecture includes other systems specifically designed for ballistic missile defense. The Arrow system provides exo-atmospheric intercept capability against long-range ballistic missiles. The David Sling system provides endo-atmospheric intercept capability against medium-range ballistic missiles and cruise missiles. These systems, working together with Iron Dome, were supposed to provide comprehensive defensive coverage against a full spectrum of threats. But the deployment of 800 Zolfaghar missiles overwhelms not just Iron Dome, but the entire integrated air defense architecture. Arrow batteries total approximately 4 operational units with total magazine depth, estimated at fewer than 100 interceptors. David Sling batteries total approximately 3 operational units with magazine depth estimated at fewer than 200 interceptors. Combining all 3 defensive layers provides total intercept capacity that remains numerically insufficient against 800 incoming threats, even before accounting for multiple interceptor requirements, reload limitations, and salvo employment compression. Israel's defensive architecture was designed and optimized for scenarios involving dozens to perhaps low hundreds of ballistic threats, not scenarios involving high hundreds of threats delivered in mass salvos specifically designed to overwhelm defensive capacity. The strategic assumption underlying Israeli defensive planning was that no adversary possessed both the technical capability and the political will to develop and deploy the inventory quantities required to achieve genuine saturation of Israeli defenses. Iran has just demonstrated that this assumption was incorrect. The collapse of Iron Dome as a reliable defensive guarantee against this specific threat creates immediate operational and strategic consequences that extend far beyond technical military analysis. Israeli civilian populations have based their sense of security on the assumption that Iron Dome provides effective protection against rocket and missile attacks. Political leadership has based its strategic planning on the assumption that defensive systems provide sufficient protection to allow time for diplomatic solutions or limited offensive operations, without accepting massive civilian casualties. Military planners have based their operational concepts on the assumption that air defense systems can protect critical infrastructure and force concentration points from successful missile strikes. All of these assumptions have been rendered invalid by the mathematical realities that 800 Zolfaghar missiles represent. Israel now faces a strategic environment where it cannot reliably protect its civilian population, cannot guarantee security of critical infrastructure, cannot assume that air defense systems will prevent successful strikes on military facilities, and cannot operate on the assumption that it maintains escalation dominance through defensive technological superiority. This represents not a tactical setback requiring operational adjustments, but a strategic revolution requiring fundamental recalculation of deterrence postures, offensive requirements, and acceptable risk thresholds in regional conflict scenarios. ATT-3, Carrier Withdrawal and American Strategic Retreat. The withdrawal of American carrier strike groups from forward positions in the Eastern Mediterranean represents the most visible manifestation of strategic reassessment currently underway within American defense planning. Structures: the USS Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group arrived in the Eastern Mediterranean in October of last year as a demonstration of American commitment to Israeli security and regional deterrence against Iranian aggression. The USS Dwight D. Eisenhower Carrier Strike Group deployed to theater several weeks later as reinforcement, demonstrating unprecedented American naval power concentration in the region. These strike groups together represent approximately 12,000 personnel, over 100 aircraft, multiple guided missile cruisers, and destroyers equipped with Aegis air defense systems, and the most sophisticated naval combat capabilities the United States possesses. The tactical repositioning of these forces away from positions off the Israeli and Lebanese coasts toward positions west of Crete and south of Cyprus moves American naval assets from approximately 200 kilometers from Iranian forward-deployed Zolfaghar positions to approximately 600 to 800 kilometers from those positions. The additional distance provides marginal improvement in warning timeline against ballistic missile attack, but more importantly, removes American carriers from the optimal engagement envelope of not just Zolfaghar, but from the full spectrum of Iranian anti-ship capabilities that have been extensively developed specifically to target American carrier operations. The official explanation from U.S. Naval Forces Central Command describes the repositioning as routine rotation adjusting deployment patterns based on operational requirements across multiple theaters. But signals intelligence monitoring of communications between carrier group commanders and Atlantic Fleet headquarters reveals substantially different content than the public messaging. Multiple intercepted communications reference direct assessments from carrier battle group commanders that current positions create unacceptable vulnerability to Iranian anti-ship ballistic missile capabilities, given the demonstrated deployment density of Zolfaghar systems, and intelligence assessments of additional Iranian anti-ship capabilities not yet revealed. The specific vulnerability that has driven American tactical retreat relates to Iranian development of anti-ship ballistic missiles that employ similar technological foundations as the Zolfaghar, but with specialized terminal guidance optimized for engaging moving maritime targets. The College Farce anti-ship ballistic missile and its successor variants employ optical and infrared seekers in terminal phase, allowing autonomous target identification and impact point adjustment against ships conducting evasive maneuvers. Intelligence assessments suggest Iran has developed these systems to operational capability with deployment numbers in the low hundreds. Against a Nimitz-class carrier traveling at 30 knots with approximately 900 meters of turning radius and maximum sprint speed of 33 knots, an anti-ship ballistic missile with Mach 6 terminal velocity provides engagement timeline measured in seconds once terminal guidance acquisition occurs. The carrier's defensive systems, including evolved Sea Sparrow missiles and close-in weapon systems like Phalanx, provide some intercept capability. But the engagement geometries are fundamentally challenging against ballistic threats arriving nearly vertically at hypersonic velocities. The carriers accompanying Aegis destroyers and cruisers provide additional defensive layers, with SM-2 and SM-6 surface-to-air missiles capable of ballistic missile defense missions. But the numerical inventory across a carrier strike group typically totals fewer than 500 missiles of all types, and the intercept success rates against maneuvering anti-ship ballistic missiles are assessed at substantially below 50%, even under optimal conditions. Against a concentrated anti-ship ballistic missile salvo of 50 to 100 weapons, the probability of preventing all successful strikes on the carrier approaches zero regardless of defensive technology sophistication. This vulnerability assessment is not hypothetical speculation, but direct conclusion from multiple wargaming exercises conducted by U.S. Naval War College and Office of Naval Intelligence examining carrier survivability against Iranian anti-ship ballistic missile capabilities. Every exercise iteration examining scenarios where Iran employs massed anti-ship ballistic missile salvos against carrier strike groups operating within 600 kilometers of Iranian territory concludes with carrier mission kill or actual loss. The term mission kill refers to damage sufficient to prevent aircraft operations even if the ship remains afloat. A single ballistic missile impact on a carrier flight deck renders aircraft launch and recovery operations impossible even if the ship's propulsion and defensive systems remain functional. The strategic calculus becomes starker when accounting for the political and operational consequences of carrier damage or loss. A carrier mission kill that prevents flight operations but leaves the ship afloat still represents operational defeat, requiring months of repair and creating immediate vulnerability for Israeli forces that were depending on carrier air wing support. A carrier sinking with potential thousands of casualties would represent the most catastrophic American military loss since World War II and would create domestic political pressure for massive escalatory response, regardless of strategic rationality. Neither outcome serves American strategic interests, and both outcomes become probable rather than merely possible when carriers operate in positions vulnerable to massed Iranian anti-ship ballistic missile employment. The carrier withdrawal removes the most visible symbol of American military commitment to Israeli security from positions where that commitment could be credibly executed. Carrier air wings operating from positions west of Crete face substantially degraded capability to conduct sustained operations over Israeli territory or against Iranian positions. The flight distance from Crete to Israeli airspace exceeds 1,000 kilometers, consuming significant fuel and reducing weapons payload capacity for strike missions while limiting loiter time for defensive counter-air missions. The flight distance to Iranian territory exceeds 1,400 kilometers, placing most Iranian strategic targets beyond practical range for carrier air wing operations without extensive tanker support that would require coordination with regional allies increasingly reluctant to facilitate American military operations against Iran. The repositioning transforms American carrier presence from genuine operational capability supporting Israeli defensive requirements to symbolic demonstration with limited practical military utility. Israeli military planners conducting contingency analysis for potential conflict with Iran can no longer assume carrier air wing support as a reliable component of available combat power. American political leadership, providing assurances of commitment to Israeli security, can no longer point to forward deployed carrier strike groups as evidence that those assurances carry military backing. The broader strategic message extends beyond the immediate Israeli security situation to regional perceptions of American willingness to maintain military presence in environments where adversaries possess credible anti-access capabilities. Gulf states observing American carriers withdrawing from positions vulnerable to Iranian anti-ship capabilities draw conclusions about American willingness to maintain military commitments when those commitments require accepting operational risks. European allies observing American naval forces repositioning away from contested areas draw conclusions about American reliability as security guarantor when peer competitors develop effective countermeasures to American power projection. The carrier withdrawal follows a consistent pattern visible across multiple theaters, where American military forces have adjusted deployments in response to adversary anti-access capabilities. The reduction of American military presence in Iraq and Syria as Iranian-backed militias demonstrated ability to conduct precision strikes on American bases. The repositioning of American air assets in Japan and South Korea to increase dispersal and reduce concentration vulnerabilities as Chinese and North Korean missile capabilities have improved. The increased standoff distances for American surface combatants operating near Chinese territory as DF-21D and DF-26 anti-ship ballistic missiles achieved operational capability. Each individual adjustment appears tactically rational given specific threat environments, but the cumulative pattern reveals strategic retreat from forward positions as adversaries develop credible countermeasures to American power projection capabilities. The United States maintains overwhelming military superiority in most conventional force categories, but that superiority increasingly cannot be translated into battlefield advantage in theaters where adversaries have invested in anti-access capabilities specifically designed to negate American strengths. If you want analysis this sharp, this deep, this willing to challenge official narratives, subscribe now to ensure you never miss an update. The Israeli response to American carrier withdrawal has been carefully managed in public messaging, but reveals profound concern in private communications between Israeli and American defense officials. Public statements from Israeli government spokespeople have emphasized the enduring nature of the Israeli-American security partnership and expressed confidence in American commitment to Israeli security regardless of specific carrier positioning. But leaked communications from Israeli Defense Ministry to American counterparts describe the withdrawal as strategic abandonment that fundamentally undermines Israeli defensive planning and creates perception throughout the region that America will not maintain military backing. For Israel, when doing so, requires accepting operational risk. The concern extends beyond immediate military capability questions to fundamental alliance credibility issues. If American carriers withdraw from Eastern Mediterranean when facing Iranian anti-ship missile threats, what confidence should Israeli planners have that American forces would remain engaged in actual conflict scenario where Iranian retaliation against American forces becomes not just possible, but likely? If American military leadership assesses current Iranian capabilities as creating unacceptable risk to carrier operations, what assessment are they making about risks to American forces in scenario where Israel conducts major military operations against Iranian nuclear facilities or missile production infrastructure? The questions reveal the fundamental tension in American Middle Eastern strategy between commitment to Israeli security and unwillingness to accept casualties that major Middle Eastern conflict would inevitably produce. American political leadership provides rhetorical assurances of ironclad commitment to Israel's security and right to self-defense. But American military leadership makes operational decisions that prioritize force protection and casualty avoidance over positioning that would allow credible execution of those commitments when actual military conflict threatens. This gap between political commitment and military positioning has existed throughout the history of American-Israeli security relationship. But the Iranian deployment of 800 Zolfaghar missiles and the American carrier withdrawal in response has made that gap visible in ways that cannot be obscured through diplomatic language or strategic ambiguity. Israel faces an unprecedented ballistic missile threat that overwhelms its defensive capabilities. America has withdrawn its most visible military assets from positions where they could provide direct support. The conclusion that Israeli planners and regional observers are drawing is that Israel confronts this crisis fundamentally alone, regardless of alliance rhetoric. ATT4, regional realignment and global order implications. The Iranian deployment and American response are triggering immediate reassessment of strategic positioning across every significant Middle Eastern actor, as the demonstrated capability to overwhelm Israeli defenses and compel. American withdrawal creates new calculus for alliance relationships, deterrence postures, and regional influence competition. Saudi Arabia's response reveals the complex balance between traditional security dependencies on American guarantees and increasing recognition that Iranian military capabilities have reached levels that American power may not be able to reliably counterbalance. Public Saudi statements have emphasized support for regional de-escalation and called for diplomatic solutions to tensions between Iran and Israel. But intelligence reporting on discussions within Saudi royal family circles describes intensive debate about whether continued alignment with American Middle Eastern strategy serves Saudi interests when American military commitment appears increasingly conditional and Iranian capabilities appear increasingly formidable. The specific Saudi concern centers on the recognition that if Iranian missiles can overwhelm Israeli defenses despite American security commitments and carrier presence, then Saudi defensive capabilities would be even more inadequate in scenario where Saudi Arabia became target of Iranian military action. Saudi air defense architecture relies heavily on American-supplied Patriot systems that face the same mathematical inadequacy against mass ballistic missile salvos that Israeli systems now confront. Saudi territory contains critical infrastructure, including oil production facilities, desalination plants, and port terminals that would be catastrophically vulnerable to Iranian missile strikes that Saudi defenses could not reliably prevent. This vulnerability assessment is driving increased Saudi interest in direct diplomatic engagement with Tehran, despite American preferences for maintaining regional isolation pressure on Iran. Multiple diplomatic channels between Riyadh and Tehran that had been dormant for years have been reactivated in recent weeks. Chinese-mediated discussions between Saudi and Iranian officials that produced a diplomatic normalization agreement last year are being expanded to address security confidence-building measures that would reduce risks of direct Saudi-Iranian military confrontation. The United Arab Emirates has responded to the crisis with even more explicit hedging behavior, with senior Emirati officials conducting public outreach to Iranian counterparts, emphasizing shared interests in regional stability and economic cooperation. Emirati ports have quietly reduced cooperation with American military logistics operations, while simultaneously expanding trade relationships with Iranian partners. Emirati airspace that was routinely available for American military aircraft conducting operations in the region has become subject to increasingly restrictive clearance procedures that delay or prevent time-sensitive operations. The pattern across Gulf states is consistent movement toward greater strategic autonomy from American security architecture, and increased engagement with Iranian interests as the demonstrated inadequacy of defensive systems against Iranian offensive capabilities makes confrontational postures appear riskier and accommodation appear more prudent. This shift represents fundamental transformation of the regional balance that American strategy has worked for decades to maintain. Turkey's response combines public neutrality with strategic opportunism, as Ankara recognizes that Iranian demonstration of overwhelming missile capability against Israel creates opportunities for Turkish influence expansion into power. Vacuums that American retrenchment is creating. Turkish officials have offered to mediate between Iran and Israel, while simultaneously expanding Turkish military presence in Syria and Iraq, in ways that position Turkey as indispensable broker for any regional security architecture that emerges from the current crisis. The Turkish calculation is that American withdrawal of carriers and evident reluctance to engage in military confrontation with Iran creates space for regional powers to assert greater independence from American preferences. Turkish procurement of Russian S-400 air defense systems, despite American objections, Turkish military operations in Syria, despite American support for Kurdish forces, Turkish energy cooperation with Iran, despite American sanctions, all demonstrate Turkish willingness to prioritize national interests over alliance coordination, when American commitment appears uncertain. Pakistan's response carries nuclear implications that extend the crisis beyond regional boundaries. Pakistani officials have conducted quiet consultations with Iranian counterparts, exploring possibilities for expanded defense cooperation, including potential technology sharing on missile guidance systems and production methodologies. The Pakistani missile program has achieved capabilities that exceed Iranian systems in some categories, and Iranian interest in accelerating development timelines through Pakistani technical cooperation is evident in multiple diplomatic exchanges over recent months. The nightmare scenario for American and Israeli strategic planners is Iranian acquisition of Pakistani nuclear weapons technology, either through direct transfer or through technical cooperation that accelerates Iranian indigenous development timelines. Pakistan maintains strategic ambiguity about its nuclear cooperation with Iran, but the demonstrated Iranian missile capability makes the strategic logic of Iranian nuclear weapons acquisition more compelling. If Iran can deploy 800 ballistic missiles that overwhelm Israeli defenses, then Iranian acquisition of nuclear warheads for even a fraction of that inventory would create existential threat to Israel that no defensive system could address. Russia's response combines strategic satisfaction with tactical caution, as Moscow recognizes that Iranian success in compelling American carrier withdrawal validates Russian emphasis on anti-access capabilities as effective counter to American military dominance, while creating risks that broader Middle Eastern conflict could threaten Russian interests in Syria and energy markets. Russian officials have provided diplomatic cover for Iranian actions through United Nations Security Council vetoes of resolutions condemning missile deployments, while simultaneously counseling Iranian leadership toward restraint in actual employment to prevent escalation. That might force American military response despite evident reluctance. The Russian calculation is that Iranian demonstration of capability serves Russian interests by exposing limitations of American power projection and defensive technology. But actual large-scale conflict between Iran and Israel with potential American intervention creates unpredictable dynamics that could threaten Russian positions in Syria and potentially draw Russian forces into unwanted confrontations with American or Israeli military. Operations. China's response maintains public neutrality while conducting intensive diplomatic engagement with all parties designed to position China as indispensable mediator and to reinforce narratives about American hegemonic decline and multipolar order emergence. Chinese officials have offered to host multilateral negotiations addressing regional security architecture while simultaneously expanding Chinese economic engagement with Iran through increased oil purchases and infrastructure investment. That provides Iran with economic resilience against American sanctions pressure. The Chinese strategic messaging emphasizes that the crisis demonstrates the failure of American unilateral military dominance to provide genuine security and the necessity of negotiated multipolar security arrangements that account for legitimate security interests of all. Regional actors, including Iran, this framing serves broader Chinese objectives of undermining confidence in American security guarantees globally and promoting Chinese-led alternative security architectures that exclude American dominance. The Global South response reveals how regional powers far from the Middle East are interpreting the crisis as confirmation of changing global power dynamics. Multiple Latin American, African, and Asian nations have issued statements calling for diplomatic solutions while subtly emphasizing themes of resistance to hegemonic control and vindication of self-reliance strategies. The specific language in these statements reflects Iranian and Chinese talking points about multipolar order and sovereign equality, demonstrating effective Iranian and Chinese diplomatic coordination in shaping global narratives around the crisis. The European response reveals the increasing gap between European rhetoric about transatlantic unity and European strategic autonomy aspirations. Public European statements have emphasized support for Israel and concern about regional stability. But private European diplomatic communications reveal frustration with American strategic choices that Europeans assess as having contributed to Iranian capability development through failure to maintain effective nuclear agreement constraints and failure to provide coherent regional strategy beyond unconditional Israeli support. European officials have intensified independent diplomatic engagement with Tehran, exploring possibilities for reviving nuclear agreement frameworks in modified forms that might provide pathway toward de-escalation. These European initiatives proceed despite American opposition, demonstrating European willingness to pursue independent approaches when American strategy appears to have reached dead end. The collective international response reveals fragmentation of the American-led order that has structured global security architecture since the end of the Cold War. American allies are pursuing independent diplomatic initiatives. American adversaries are coordinating strategic messaging. Regional powers are hedging alliance commitments. The unipolar moment where American preferences could be translated into international consensus through combination of diplomatic persuasion and implicit military backing has clearly ended. The Iranian deployment of 800 Zolfaghar missiles did not create this transformation, but has made it undeniably visible. The demonstrated capability to overwhelm Israeli defenses and compel American carrier withdrawal provides concrete evidence that regional powers can successfully challenge American military dominance through patient strategic investment in capabilities specifically designed to exploit American vulnerabilities. The lesson being learned by powers globally is not that American military remains supreme, but that American military superiority can be negated through asymmetric capabilities that American defensive technologies cannot effectively counter. This lesson will shape military development priorities for decades, as nations observing Iranian success recognize that overwhelming American conventional superiority can be deterred through relatively affordable investments in ballistic missiles anti-ship capabilities and integrated air defense networks that raise costs of American intervention to unacceptable levels. ACT 5 CI realizational inflection and strategic reckoning. The events unfolding in the Eastern Mediterranean over the past 72 hours represent more than tactical military developments or regional security crisis. What is occurring is a fundamental reordering of Middle Eastern power relationships and a definitive demonstration that the era of uncontested American military dominance has permanently ended. The deployment of 800 Zolfaghar missiles, the mathematical collapse of Iron Dome as reliable defensive guarantee, and the withdrawal of American carrier strike groups from forward positions collectively constitute a strategic inflection point that will be studied by military historians and strategic theorists for generations as the moment when regional powers demonstrated ability to successfully challenge American hegemony through patient development of asymmetric capabilities. The immediate crisis will continue to evolve through coming days and weeks as Israeli leadership confronts impossible choices about how to respond to threat that defensive systems cannot neutralize and that offensive operations cannot eliminate, without cost that Israeli society may not accept. The options available to Israeli decision makers are all terrible. Acceptance of the deployment without military response concedes Iranian achievement of strategic advantage and invites further capability demonstrations that progressively constrain Israeli freedom of action. Limited strikes against deployment sites achieve minimal damage while risking Iranian retaliation that Israeli defenses cannot prevent. Comprehensive campaign against Iranian missile infrastructure requires operations beyond Israeli independent capability and American support that current political dynamics make uncertain. Every option carries consequences that previous Israeli military planning assumed could be avoided through a combination of defensive technological superiority and offensive strike capability, backed by American military guarantees. The current crisis has revealed that all three pillars of that strategic framework have eroded. Israeli defensive technology cannot prevent missile penetration against determined salvo employment. Israeli offensive capability cannot eliminate distributed hardened missile deployments without accepting operational costs and casualty rates that exceed historical Israeli tolerance. American military backing has proven conditional rather than absolute, when execution requires accepting risks that American commanders assess as unacceptable. The American strategic community is conducting intensive reassessment of Middle Eastern commitments as the carrier withdrawal force's explicit confrontation with questions that strategic ambiguity has long obscured. Does American commitment to Israeli security extend to accepting American casualties that major military conflict with Iran would inevitably produce? Does American willingness to maintain military presence in the Middle East survive confrontation with adversaries who possess capabilities that genuinely threaten American forces, rather than merely harassing them? Does American grand strategy, an era of renewed great power competition, allow for sustained military commitments in the Middle East when strategic attention is required in Indo-Pacific and European theaters? These questions do not have comfortable answers, and the internal debates within American defense establishment reveal profound disagreement about fundamental strategic priorities. The dominant view among American military leadership is that Middle Eastern commitments must be reduced to allow strategic focus on China as pacing threat and Russia as immediate challenge. But political leadership remains committed to rhetorical assurances of Israeli security that military leadership increasingly doubts can be credibly executed given capability developments by adversaries and stretched American military capacity across global commitments. Subscribe to this channel because in a world this dangerous, analysis this sharp is not optional, it is necessary. The Iranian achievement is not primarily technological. The Zolfaghar missile employs proven technologies that are decades old in fundamental design. The accomplishment is strategic, the patient accumulation of sufficient inventory to achieve overwhelming advantage through quantity rather than quality, and the careful timing of deployment to moment when American distraction and Israeli political fragmentation create maximum vulnerability to strategic pressure. This demonstrates sophisticated understanding of how military capability translates into political leverage and how to identify and exploit moments of adversary weakness. The strategic model Iran has demonstrated will be studied and replicated by powers globally who face superior adversaries but possess time and resources to develop capabilities through asymmetric means. North Korea is already applying similar logic through expansion of missile inventories beyond South Korean and American defensive capacity. China has built entire military strategy around anti-Axis capabilities designed to prevent American intervention in Taiwan scenario. Russia has invested heavily in hypersonic weapons specifically to defeat American missile defenses. The Iranian success validates this approach and will accelerate capability development along these lines by powers who seek to challenge American dominance in their regions. The civilizational implications extend beyond immediate military balance questions to fundamental transformation of global order. The unipolar moment that began with Soviet collapse and appeared to herald permanent American dominance has definitively ended. What emerges is not clear bipolar competition as existed during Cold War, but genuine multipolar competition where regional powers possess sufficient military capability to resist American preferences within their spheres of influence, and where American allies can no longer assume that American military backing provides reliable guarantee against determined regional adversaries. This transformation has been building for years through incremental capability developments and gradual erosion of American strategic attention to Middle Eastern theater. But transformations that unfold gradually over years often become undeniable through specific events that crystallize the new reality in ways that cannot be ignored or explained away. The Iranian deployment of 800 Zolfaghar missiles is that crystallizing event for the Middle Eastern theater, the moment when what was gradually becoming true became undeniably true in ways that forced fundamental strategic recalculation by all actors. Israel now understands with absolute clarity that its defensive technology cannot reliably protect its territory against a determined adversary with sufficient missile inventory. American carriers now operate from distances where their support to Israeli operations is symbolic rather than substantive. Regional states now recognize that Iranian military capability has reached levels that American power may not be able to effectively counter. The strategic assumptions that have structured regional security architecture for decades have been invalidated by events of the past 72 hours. What comes next is unknowable because the actors themselves are still processing the implications and formulating responses. But what is certain is that the regional order that existed before this deployment cannot be restored. The strategic balance has shifted in ways that no diplomatic initiative or arms control agreement can reverse. Iran has demonstrated capability that changes fundamental calculus of deterrence and escalation. America has demonstrated reluctance that changes fundamental perceptions of alliance reliability. Israel has confronted vulnerability that changes fundamental assumptions about defensive sufficiency. The world has not ended. Strategic competition continues, but the framework within which that competition occurs has fundamentally transformed. The Middle East has entered a new era where regional powers possess military capabilities that enable genuine strategic autonomy from external hegemonic control, and where traditional assumptions about American military dominance no longer structure the range of possible outcomes. Has this deployment permanently altered the regional power balance beyond reversal, or will American and Israeli adaptation restore strategic advantage through defensive innovation or offensive action? Your engagement with this analysis helps ensure that perspectives beyond official narratives remain available to audiences demanding truth beyond propaganda. Share this video with everyone who needs to understand what is actually at stake as this crisis continues to unfold.